The stream, lifeblood of Athelberg, tasted of stone and memory. Lyra, barely a woman, knew its voice better than her own. It whispered secrets in the gurgle over smooth pebbles, roared prophecies in the spring floods, and sang mournful dirges when the summer sun beat down too fiercely on the Apennine peaks that cradled their valley. For generations her forebears, the waterkeepers of Athelberg, had listened, interpreted, and guided its flow through an intricate network of channels and cisterns carved from the very mountainside. Now the stream was troubled, and its disquiet echoed in Lyra's heart. She ran a calloused palm over the cool, moss-slicked stone of the grand conduit, a scar above her left eyebrow, legacy of a childhood flood that had stolen her younger brother, pulling tight. The water level was lower than it should be for this time of year, the current less vigorous. The air, usually thick with the scent of damp earth and the wild herbs clinging to the channel walls, carried a drier, dustier note. The ancestors provided. Elder Kaelin's voice, raspy as dry leaves, startled her. He stood a little way off, his gaze fixed on the diminished flow, his face a relief map of wrinkles etched by sun and worry. Their ways have always been sufficient. Lyra bit back the retort that the ancestors hadn't faced 3 seasons of meagre winter snows and summers that scorched the high pastures. "The channels need clearing higher up, Kaelin," she said instead, her voice low. "The feeder springs seem choked." Kaelin shook his head, the movement stiff. "The rituals will be performed. The spirits of the mountain must be appeased. It is not for us to question their flow, only to receive it with gratitude." Lyra felt a familiar frustration tighten her chest. Gratitude was well and good, but it wouldn't fill the cisterns. Athelberg was a jewel, a hidden valley where ingenuity had made life flourish. Their terraces, fed by the carefully managed water, were green and bountiful when surrounding lands often struggled. This mastery was their pride, their identity. But lately that pride felt brittle. She remembered the stories her father, the previous waterkeeper, had told, not just of triumphs, but of ancient challenges, of systems that had to be rethought, adapted. He had encouraged her curiosity, her relentless questioning, a trait that now often set her at odds with the Council of Elders. The silence stretched, broken only by the stream's subdued murmur. Kaelin finally spoke, his eyes still on the water. "There is talk from the traders. A new power rises in the plains. They call themselves unifiers." He spat the word as if it were poison. "They say they bring order, but what order can there be when they do not respect the ancient spirits of each place?" Lyra's attention sharpened. Traders rarely ventured this high, their paths usually sticking to the broader, easier valleys. That they brought such news was an ill omen in itself. What manner of unifiers? "They build roads straight as a thrown spear," Kaelin said, his lip curling. "They divert rivers without heed for the old ways. Their leader, a man named Valerius, speaks of a single law for all lands, a single tongue." He paused. "They have legions. The word conjured images of disciplined force, of something vast and unyielding. Athelberg had its able-bodied men, skilled hunters and cragsmen, but they were a community, not an army. Their strength lay in their isolation, their unique knowledge. "They are far from us," Lyra said, more to reassure herself than Kaelin. "The world shrinks, Lyra, when men like Valerius stride it." Kaelin turned, his gaze finally meeting hers, ancient and weary. "Tend to your duties. Trust the ancestors. The water will provide, as it always has." He walked away, his figure stooped but resolute. Lyra remained by the conduit, the coolness of the stone seeping into her hand. The water, she knew, was not a passive gift. It was a conversation, a partnership. And lately its voice was strained, its breath shallow. The ancestors had been wise, yes, but they had also been innovators in their time. They had listened and responded. To simply repeat their actions without their understanding, their willingness to adapt, that, Lyrola felt, was the true betrayal of their legacy. The scar above her eye throbbed faintly. The memory of that long-ago flood, the terrifying roar of the water, the small cold hand slipping from hers, was a constant, visceral reminder of nature's indifferent power and the terrible cost of failing to understand it. She would not let Athelberg be swept away by a tide of complacency or fear. The unifiers were a distant threat, perhaps. The failing stream was here now. And she, Lyra, waterkeeper in all but name, would find a way to make it sing again. A week later, the sky, which had remained a pitiless, brassy blue, finally cracked. But it was not the gentle, soaking rain Ethelberg prayed for. A violent thunderstorm, born of the unnatural summer heat, slammed into the Apennines. Lightning split the peaks, and rain fell not in drops but in sheets, a furious deluge that turned the mountain trails into torrents. Lyra was high on the slopes, inspecting a series of older, smaller catchments her father had shown her when the storm broke. She scrambled for shelter under an overhang, watching with growing dread as the narrow gorge that fed the northern spur channel began to boil. The roar was deafening. And then, with a sound like the mountain itself groaning in agony, a section of the gorge wall, undercut by seasons of subtle erosion and now battered by the flash flood, gave way. Tons of rock, soil, and uprooted trees crashed into the surging water, forming a crude, massive dam. The northern spur, which irrigated nearly a third of Ethelberg's lower terraces, was instantly choked. By the time the storm abated and Lyra could make her way precariously down to the site of the collapse, the extent of the disaster was clear. A vast, muddy lake was forming behind the landslide, while below it, the northern spur channel was already dwindling to a trickle. The air thrummed with an unnatural silence where the rush of water should have been. She found Kaelin and a handful of other men already there, their faces grim. "The mountain has spoken," Kaelin said, his voice heavy. "We have angered the spirits." "We have neglected the signs," Lyra countered, her voice sharp with urgency and a grief that felt like a vice around her heart. "This section of the gorge has been unstable for years. Father noted it in his journals. He planned to reinforce it. The old reinforcements held for generations," another elder Demetrius snapped. "It is this new imbalance, this questioning." His eyes flicked towards Lyra. "Questioning is what built these systems." Lyra shot back, her patience fraying. "The ancestors didn't just inherit them, they created them, adapted them. This needs more than rituals, Kaelin. We need to clear this, and we need to do it now, or the lower fields will be dust by moon's end." The men looked at the chaotic jumble of rock and debris. It was a monumental task, far beyond their usual maintenance. The traditional methods, levers, pry bars, communal effort, would take weeks, months even. Just then a figure appeared on the path below, leading a laden mule. It was Rorik, the trader, his cloak dark with rain, his weathered face unreadable. He usually came only once or twice a season. His arrival now felt portentous. He surveyed the scene, his gaze missing nothing. "Looks like the mountain gave you a new puzzle, eh?" he said, his voice surprisingly calm amidst the devastation. He unslung a waterskin, brought some lowland wine and news. He took a swig. "Valerius's men are on the move. They've pacified the Sylvan Valley 3 days' walk from here. Offered them protection and improved water management." He gave a wry smile. "Seems their engineers are very thorough. They're looking for new sources, new routes, expanding." The implication hung heavy in the damp air. Ethelberg, with its legendary water systems, would be a prize. And now, with a critical artery severed, their vulnerability was starkly exposed. Lyra looked from the devastating landslide to Rorik's knowing eyes, then to Kaelin's grime, tradition-bound face. The stream's silence from the northern spur was a shout of warning. The distant thunder of Valerius's ambition was drawing nearer. Her personal desire to understand and master the water had just collided with the crushing weight of her community's survival. The path ahead was as treacherous and uncertain as the storm-lashed mountainside. The days that followed were a blur of frantic effort and simmering tension. Kaelin, clinging to the familiar, organized purification rites and offerings at the shrine of the Source Spirit, a small, moss-covered grotto high above the valley. Lyra, meanwhile, gathered a small group of younger Ethelbergers, those less bound by unyielding tradition and more willing to listen to her practical, urgent assessments. Her younger cousin, Theron, a wiry youth with quick hands and an even quicker mind, became her shadow. "The old ways are too slow," she told them, her voice hoarse from dust and exertion as they stood before the landslide. "We need to think like the water itself. Find the path of least resistance, but with force." She had spent hours poring over her father's meticulously drawn diagrams, notes scrawled in the margins hinting at techniques for moving large stones, principles of leverage he'd observed in nature, ideas he'd perhaps never had the chance or the political will to implement. Kaelin and the council watched their efforts with disapproval. "The girl plays with forces she does not understand," Demetrius muttered loud enough for Lyra to hear. "She'll bring more misfortune." Lyra ignored them, focusing her team on strategic points. They couldn't move the largest boulders, not yet, but they could clear the smaller debris, try to create channels for the trapped water to seep through, relieving some of the pressure. It was back-breaking, dangerous work. Small rockfalls were frequent. The mud was slick and treacherous. Rorik, surprisingly, stayed on. He didn't participate directly in the labour. "My back's seen too many roads for that kind of dance," he'd said, but he offered advice, quietly, to Lyra. He'd seen rock slides in his travels, seen how different peoples dealt with them. He showed her a knot for securing ropes that was stronger than any Æthelberg used, a way to brace a lever for maximum effect. He even produced a small, ingeniously folded metal shovel from his mule's pack, a tool of a design Lyra had never encountered, far more efficient than their wooden spades. "Where did you get this?" Lyra asked, examining its keen edge. "Valerius's people make them," Rorik said casually, watching her reaction. "Standard issue for their pioneers. They value efficiency." The word from his lips sounded both like a promise and a threat. Lyra felt a chill despite the sweat on her brow. Efficiency, yes, but at what cost to the land, to the spirit of a place? Æthelberg's channels were not straight. They followed the contours of the mountain, respected sacred groves bent around ancient marker stones. There was a wisdom in that, a harmony Valerius's straight lines would surely obliterate. One evening, covered in mud and exhaustion, Lyra sat by the dying fire in her small dwelling, her father's journals open on her lap. The script was faded, the drawings intricate. He wrote of the breath of the mountain, the subtle shifts in temperature and pressure that could herald changes in the springs, of listening to the song of the stones to understand their stability. It was a language she was only beginning to learn, a knowledge far deeper than mere engineering. Kaelin spoke of spirits. Her father spoke of observable phenomena, yet both seemed to touch upon the same underlying truth of interconnectedness. A passage caught her eye, the great cistern of the elders, long disused. Its inlet is hidden, its capacity immense. Legend says it was sealed after the long dry, when its waters became bitter. But the bitterness, I suspect, was not of the water, but of despair, the mechanism of its seal. The rest of the page was damaged, water-stained from some past mishap. The great cistern. Lyra had heard whispers of it, a place of ill omen, but her father had clearly been investigating it. If it could be found, unsealed, its capacity could alleviate their current crisis significantly, at least for a time. But where was its inlet, and how was it sealed? The next day, the drought that had preceded the storm reasserted itself with a vengeance. The sun beat down relentlessly. The temporary relief from the trapped water above the landslide was dwindling. The lower terraces, deprived of the northern spur, were beginning to show the pale, sickly signs of thirst. Panic began to whisper through Æthelberg. Kaelin announced a 3-day fast and continuous vigil at the source shrine. "We must show the spirits our devotion, our contrition," he proclaimed. Lyra, desperate, approached him. "Kaelin, the great cistern. Father wrote of it. Do you know its location?" Kaelin's face hardened. "That place is forbidden. Its waters are cursed. Your father dabbled in things best left undisturbed. It is this constant seeking of new, forbidden paths that has brought us to this pass." "Or perhaps," Lyra said, her voice trembling slightly with a rare display of anger, "it is the fear of new paths that keeps us trapped on a failing one." The confrontation left a bitter taste. She knew Kaelin was afraid, as they all were, but his fear was paralyzing Æthelberg. Rorik found her later, staring at the parched earth. "Stubborn old goat, isn't he?" he remarked, not unkindly. "But he loves this valley, in his way." He paused. "Valerius's emissaries are 2 days out. A courtesy visit, they call it, to offer assistance to their neighbours in this time of climatic variability." His tone was dry. 2 days. The noose was tightening. "The great cistern," Lyra said, almost to herself. "If I could find it." Rorik looked at her speculatively. "Old stories sometimes have deep roots. What did your father's journal say about its seal?" The page was damaged. Something about a mechanism. Rorik rubbed his chin. Mechanisms. Valerius loves mechanisms. His people are masters of gears and levers on a grand scale. But sometimes the old ways have their own cunning. He looked up at the highest, most inaccessible peaks, where only the eagles dared to soar. If I were hiding a vital water source, a secret of the mountain, I'd link its access to something only the mountain itself truly understands. Something that shifts, but predictably, if you know how to read it. Lyra followed his gaze. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, sharp shadows from the jagged peaks. One particular shadow, from a needle-like spire known as the Old Man's Finger, was slowly creeping across a sheer rock face miles away, a face that had always seemed barren and uninteresting. But as the shadow moved, it momentarily highlighted a peculiar discoloration, a subtle difference in the rock texture, almost like an ancient weathered seam. A sudden, electrifying thought coursed through her. A shadow lock? A mechanism that only aligned perhaps at a certain time of day, a certain time of year when the sun and shadow struck a precise point. It was an idea so audacious, so Ethelberg in its subtle complexity, that it had to be true. Her father had written of the breath of the mountain, the song of the stones. This was its language. Rorik, she said, her voice barely a whisper. The shadow, on the sky wall. He looked, squinted. A slow grin spread across his face. Well now, that's a bit more interesting than Kaelin's fasting, isn't it? Valerius's straight lines wouldn't find that in 1,000 years. He gave her a curious glance. But can you reach it before his courtesy visit? The sky wall was a treacherous climb, even for the most skilled. And if she was wrong... But the image of the parched fields, the memory of her father's questing intellect, and the chilling certainty of Valerius's imminent arrival spurred her on. The ancestors had not just built, they had encoded their deepest secrets into the very fabric of the mountains, waiting for those who knew how to listen and how to dare. Lyra, with Theron and a handful of other trusted youths, began their ascent of the sky wall before the first hint of dawn. The climb was more perilous than she had anticipated. The rock face was sheer, handholds were scarce, and the ever-present wind threatened to pluck them from their precarious perches. Her father's notes had contained rough sketches of this area, hints of ancient paths, but centuries of weathering had erased much. Each upward movement was a gamble, a testament to faith in frayed ropes and straining muscles. The scar above Lyra's eye ached, a familiar companion in moments of intense focus. She thought of Kaelin, of his rigid adherence to rituals that now felt like a comforting but ultimately hollow echo of past wisdom. He would see this ascent as hubris, another step away from the sanctioned path. But Lyra felt a different kind of connection up here, a raw, elemental dialogue with the mountain. This wasn't defiance of the ancestors, it was an attempt to understand them at their most ingenious, their most desperate. As the sun climbed, the shadow of the Old Man's Finger began its slow creep across the vast expanse of the sky wall. Lyra, clinging to a narrow ledge, watched its progress, her heart pounding. Was her wild guess correct, or were they risking their lives for a figment of her desperate imagination? Theron, agile and fearless, scouted ahead, his calls echoing faintly. "Lyra, here! The stone feels different." She pulled herself up to join him. He was pointing at the exact spot her eye had caught from the valley floor, now directly in the path of the advancing shadow. The rock here was smoother, with faint, almost invisible lines that hinted at a massive, cleverly disguised door or plug. There was no obvious handle, no lever. "The shadow," Lyra breathed, watching as its tip touched the edge of the discoloured section. It must align perfectly. They waited, muscles screaming, the wind whipping their hair. The silence was broken only by their ragged breaths and the distant cry of a hawk. Then, as the shadow of the Old Man's Finger precisely covered the disguised outline, a low, grinding sound emanated from deep within the mountain. It was a sound of immense weight shifting, of ancient mechanisms, untouched for generations, stirring to life. A faint crack appeared, widening slowly, revealing not a dark cavern but the gleam of water far below. "They did it," Theron whispered, awestruck. "The ancestors, they used the sun itself as a key." Lyra felt a wave of profound respect, almost reverence. This was engineering as artistry, as sacred knowledge. But there was no time for wonder. The mechanism, whatever it was, might not stay open long. She peered down into the gloom. A narrow, spiralling set of steps, slick with damp, seemed to descend into the mountain's heart. "We need to see where this leads," Lyra said. "Theron, stay here. If this closes, find another way. Signal Rorik if you can. Taking a flickering torch Theron offered, Lyra began the descent. The air grew cooler, heavy with the scent of ancient, undisturbed water. The steps wound down into a vast man-made cavern. And there, shimmering in the torchlight, was a body of water so immense it dwarfed any of Ethelberg's surface cisterns. The great cistern of the Elders. Its surface was still, reflecting the torch flame like a dark mirror. She dipped a hand in. The water was icy cold, pure. No hint of bitterness. Her father had been right. The bitterness was of despair, not of the water. But how to release it? She scanned the cavern walls. Her torchlight fell upon a series of massive, corroded bronze livers set into the rock, their purpose obscure. Near them, etched into the stone, were symbols, a form of Ethelberg's ancient script, more pictographic than the characters used now. She recognized some. Symbols for water, for mountain, for flow, and one that depicted a series of interconnected vessels, some higher, some lower. It was a pressure system, she realized with a jolt. The levers didn't just open a gate, they likely redirected flow, balanced pressures between this hidden reservoir and perhaps even the main feeder springs of Ethelberg, the ones that were now failing. It was a system designed not just for storage, but for regulation, a way to augment the natural flow in times of scarcity. A system of breathtaking complexity. A distant rumble from above, the mechanism beginning to close. Time was running out. She had to understand the levers. Her father's notes had been cut short. She focused on the pictograms, trying to decipher their logic. One lever seemed to indicate a primary release, but two others, they looked like safety valves, or perhaps ways to control the rate of release. Opening the main one without understanding the others could be disastrous, a flood or a pressure surge that could damage the lower channels. The ground trembled again. The light from the entrance crack far above narrowed. Meanwhile, in the valley, Kaelin's fast was in its second day. The atmosphere in Ethelberg was thick with fear and a desperate, fragile piety. He knelt before the shrine, his voice hoarse from chanting, his body weak from hunger. He prayed for a sign, for the ancestors to show mercy. It was then that two figures on horseback, clad in gleaming leather and polished metal, rode unannounced into the central clearing of Ethelberg. They were tall, confident, their eyes taking in everything with a cool, appraising gaze. Behind them, a larger group of similarly equipped men began to fan out, their movements disciplined, efficient. Valerius had arrived. He dismounted, his movements fluid, powerful. His gaze swept over the parched terraces, the worried faces of the few Ethelbergers who hadn't retreated into their homes. Rorik, who had been watching from the edge of the clearing, stepped forward, a strained neutrality on his face. "Lord Valerius," Rorik said, "an unexpected honor." Valerius smiled, a charming, predatory gleam in his eyes. "Rorik, always where the winds of change blow, I see." His gaze settled on Kaelin, who had risen unsteadily to his feet, dignity warring with apprehension. "I am Valerius. I come as a friend and admirer of Ethelberg's tenacity." He gestured towards the failing fields, "and it seems my offer of assistance is timely." His voice was smooth, reasonable, but beneath it lay an unyielding will. The unifier had come, not with overt aggression, but with the inescapable logic of power. And Lyra, the one person who might hold a key to Ethelberg's resilience, was trapped deep within the mountain, racing against time and ancient mechanisms, unaware that the future of her valley was already being decided in the sun-baked clearing below. The light from the entrance crack was now a sliver. Lyra knew she had moments. Her mind raced, connecting the pictograms, her father's fragmented notes, her own ingrained understanding of water's behavior. The main release, yes, but the smaller, counterweighted liver, it had to be a flow regulator to prevent a surge, and the third, heavier one, linked to a symbol of a deep well, perhaps an overflow to divert excess back into an even deeper aquifer rather than overwhelming the surface systems. It was a fail-safe. Trusting her instincts, honed by years of communion with water, she threw her weight against the main release lever. It resisted, groaned, then slowly, grudgingly began to move. A deep, resonant hum filled the cavern as an immense stone sluice, hidden beneath the water's surface, began to retract. Then, quickly, she hauled on the flow regulator, setting it to what she hoped was a moderate opening. The third, the overflow, she left for now. If she'd miscalculated, there was no time to correct it. A distant roar began, the sound of a vast body of water stirring from centuries of slumber, finding its ancient path. The cavern floor beneath her feet vibrated. She scrambled back towards the steps, the torch sputtering. The entrance was almost sealed. She squeezed through the narrowing gap just as the grinding sound of the great stone door reseating itself echoed behind her, plunging the great cistern back into darkness. She emerged, blinking, into the fading daylight on the high ledge, gasping for breath, her body trembling with exertion and adrenaline. Theron rushed to her. "Lyra, you're alive! We heard. The mountain roared." "The water is released," she managed, "but I don't know if I set it right." They could hear it now, a growing thunder from within the mountain, a sound not heard in Ethelberg for forgotten generations, the sound of hope or of a new unknown danger. Down in Ethelberg, the arrival of Valerius had cast a pall of fear and uncertainty. His soldiers, disciplined and numerous, moved with an unnerving efficiency, securing the perimeter of the valley, their polished armor glinting in the harsh sun. They did not overtly threaten, but their very presence was a display of power Ethelberg could not match. Valerius himself, after his initial pronouncements, had established a temporary camp near the council circle, his banner, a stylized eagle with wings outstretched, a stark new symbol against the familiar backdrop of Ethelberg's ancient meeting stones. He had requested, politely but with an undeniable undercurrent of command, a meeting with the elders. Calen, weak from his fast but his spirit unbent, faced him. Demetrius and the other elders flanked him, their faces a mixture of defiance and apprehension. Rorik stood slightly apart, a reluctant observer, his usual cynicism tinged with something akin to concern for the valley folk. "Your valley is remarkable, Elder Calen," Valerius began, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "Your ancestors were clearly masters of their environment. Such ingenuity should not be allowed to wither." He gestured again to the dry fields. "My people, the Volscians as we are known in the common tongue, we too are engineers. We bring order, shared knowledge and strength. The old ways of isolated communities struggling alone against the whims of nature or the aggression of less enlightened tribes, those days are ending." The name Volscians sent a shiver through some of the elders. Tales of their relentless expansion, their absorption of smaller communities throughout the Liris and Trerus river valleys, had reached even isolated Ethelberg. They were a people of the plains and lesser hills, but their ambition, evidently, knew no bounds. "Ethelberg has always kept its own council, its own ways," Calen stated, his voice surprisingly firm. "We honor the spirits of this place. Your order is not our order." Valerius smiled, a patient, almost paternal expression that did not reach his eyes. "Spirits are well, Elder, but spirits do not fill bellies when the streams run dry. My engineers can assess your systems, integrate them into a broader network, ensure a consistent supply. We can offer your people security, a place within a larger, more prosperous whole. In return, Ethelberg shares its resources, its skills, and its loyalty." "Loyalty?" Demetrius scoffed. "You mean submission." "Call it pragmatism," Valerius corrected smoothly. "The world changes. Those who adapt thrive. Those who cling to outmoded forms." He left the sentence unfinished, the implication clear. It was at that precise moment that a low, distant rumble began, a sound that seemed to vibrate up from the very bedrock of the valley. Heads turned. The Volscian soldiers looked uneasy, their hands moving towards their weapons. Even Valerius's composure wavered for a fraction of a second. The rumble grew, resolving into a deep, powerful roar, like nothing Ethelberg had heard since the great flood of Lyra's childhood, but this time it felt different, more controlled, more purposeful. It was the sound of an immense volume of water, suddenly unleashed. All eyes turned towards the upper slopes, towards the main feeder springs, and then they saw it. A surge, a crest of fresh, clear water, bursting from the ancient outlets of Ethelberg's primary channels, not the muddy, chaotic torrent of a flash flood, but a powerful, steady flow, far greater than any seen in living memory. It filled the dry conduits, spilled into the distribution gates, and began its life-giving journey towards the thirsty terraces. A collective gasp went through the Ethelbergers. Some fell to their knees, thinking it a miracle, a direct intervention from the spirits. Calen stared, his face a mask of disbelief and dawning, bewildered hope. Valerius's eyes narrowed, his gaze sharp and analytical. He looked towards his own engineers, who were exchanging confused, urgent glances. This was no natural occurrence. This was controlled. High on the sky wall, Lyra and Theron watched the valley transform. The newly released water snaked its way through the familiar network, a silver ribbon unfurling across the parched landscape. Relief, profound and overwhelming, washed over Lyra, so potent it left her weak. She had done it. She had understood. "You set it right," Theron breathed, his young face alight with awe. "Lyra, you saved us." But Lyra's gaze was fixed on the distant figures in the valley's centre, the glint of Volscian armour. The water was a reprieve, yes, but the other storm, the human one, had already been broken. The fight for Aethelberg's soul was just beginning. The immediate effect of the water's return was transformative. Fear gave way to a stunned, joyous activity. People rushed to open sluice gates to guide the precious flow into their desperate fields. The parched earth drank deeply. Children, who had known only dwindling streams, shrieked with delight as the channels filled. Valerius watched all this with a calculating stillness. The initial surprise on his face had been replaced by a look of intense interest. He dispatched a runner, presumably to summon his chief engineer. "It seems, Elder Calen," Valerius said, his voice cutting through the rising hubbub, "that Aethelberg possesses secrets even its current masters are not fully aware of. Or perhaps," his eyes flicked towards the mountain, "there are still those among you who understand the deeper currents." Calen, shaken but resolute, drew himself up. "The spirits of Aethelberg have provided, as they always do, for those who honour them." It was a brave front, but the bewilderment in his eyes was evident. This was beyond any ritual he knew. Rorik, who had observed the entire exchange with a shrewd, assessing gaze, caught Lyra's eye as she and Theron finally made their way, exhausted but triumphant, into the valley, clearing some time later. A barely perceptible nod from the trader acknowledged her feat. He knew. Valerius's attention fixed on Lyra immediately. Her dishevelled state, the rock dust on her clothes, the raw determination in her eyes, she was clearly no ordinary villager. "And who is this?" he inquired, his tone mild but his focus absolute. "The one who communes with mountain spirits, perhaps?" Before Calen could speak, Lyra stepped forward. "I am Lyra, daughter of Orin, of the Waterkeepers." Her voice was steady, despite the tremor of fatigue in her limbs. "The great cistern of the elders has been reopened. The ancestors provided a way." Valerius's lips curved into a knowing smile. "Ah, not spirits then, but ingenuity. Forgotten knowledge rediscovered." He looked her up and down. "You have skill, Lyra, daughter of Orin. Courage, too, it would seem." His gaze was like a physical touch, assessing, weighing. Such talents should not be confined to one small valley. The unspoken offer or threat hung in the air. The water flowed, a temporary salvation, but it had also revealed Aethelberg's greatest treasure, its hidden knowledge, to a man who coveted all that was valuable. Lyra had won a battle against drought and despair, but in doing so, she had inadvertently drawn the full attention of the unifier. The future of Aethelberg, she realized with a sinking heart, was now inextricably linked to the will of Valerius and to her own ability to navigate the treacherous currents of his ambition. The days that followed were a delicate, dangerous dance. Valerius, a consummate politician beneath his soldier's exterior, did not press his advantage overtly. He expressed admiration for Aethelberg's rediscovered heritage, and his engineers, under a stern-faced man named Drusus, respectfully requested permission to study the great cistern's release mechanism. From a safe distance, of course. Lyra, recognized by her own people as the architect of their salvation and by Valerius as a key figure, found herself at the center of these tense interactions. Calen, humbled by the undeniably potent results of Lyra's actions, yielded a measure of authority to her, though his mistrust of the Volscians remained absolute. "They smile with their lips, Lyra," he warned her in private, "but their eyes are hungry. Do not be swayed by their flatteries." Lyra needed no such warning. She met with Drusus, Valerius's chief engineer, a man whose brilliance was matched only by his arrogance. He was fascinated by the shadow lock mechanism and the pressure-regulated release from the great cistern, peppering Lyra with questions about its construction, its age, the principles behind it. Lyra answered cautiously, revealing only what was necessary, acutely aware that every piece of information she shared could be a tool Valerius might later use against them. Your ancestors were unorthodox, Drusus conceded one afternoon, sketching furiously in a wax tablet. This reliance on natural alignments, on subtle environmental cues, it's ingenious in a primitive sort of way, but highly inefficient. Our systems are standardized, replicable, not dependent on the whims of sunlight or shadow. Our systems are part of the mountain, Drusus, Lyra replied quietly. They breathe with it. Yours seek to command it. There is a difference. Drusus snorted. The difference between sentiment and progress, girl. Valerius, meanwhile, worked on the community. He distributed small gifts, salt, a luxury in their isolated valley, brightly dyed wools from the lowlands. He spoke to the younger Ethelbergers, painting enticing pictures of the world beyond their valley, of opportunities within his growing Volscian confederation for those with skill and ambition. He promised improved trade, access to new tools, security from the wilder, less predictable mountain tribes that sometimes raided isolated settlements. Some were swayed. The near disaster of the drought was fresh in their minds. The steady, disciplined presence of the Volscian soldiers offered a seductive illusion of order in a precarious world. Theron, initially Lyra's staunchest supporter, found himself drawn to the Volscians' tales of broader horizons, their displays of advanced metalworking and organized strategy. They are not monsters, Lyra, Theron argued one evening, his youthful face earnest. They value skill. Valerius himself said you have a place with them. Perhaps being part of something larger is not so bad. Perhaps it is the only way to survive what is coming. And what is coming, Theron? Lyra asked, her heart aching at his naivety. A world where every valley speaks with one voice, thinks with one mind, and pays tribute to one lord? Is that survival, or just a slower kind of vanishing? Her own internal conflict deepened. She saw the logic in some of Valerius's arguments. Aethelberg was vulnerable, its traditions perhaps too rigid for the changing times. But the thought of their unique identity, their deep, nuanced understanding of their own small piece of the world, being subsumed into Valerius's standardized empire, was unbearable. She felt the weight of generations of waterkeepers on her shoulders, a sacred trust to preserve not just the flow of water, but the spirit that understood it. The landslide on the northern spur remained a problem. While the great cistern provided ample water for now, the damage to that crucial channel limited their ability to irrigate all the terraces effectively, especially if a harsh winter reduced the cistern's replenishment. Valerius offered the services of his engineers to clear it. A gesture of goodwill, he called it, and a demonstration of Volscian efficiency. Lyra knew it was a test and a trap. If they accepted, it would be another step towards dependence. If they refused, it would seem churlish, ungrateful, and highlight their own limitations. She decided on a third path. She would lead the Ethelbergers to clear it themselves, but she would incorporate some of the principles she had observed from Rorik's Volscian shovel, some of the leverage techniques her father had hinted at, blending their own resilience with a cautious adoption of new efficiencies. It would be a statement. Ethelberg could adapt on its own terms. The work was grueling. Valerius's soldiers watched, impassive, from the ridges. Drusus sometimes came to observe, a faint sneer on his lips. But under Lyra's determined leadership, the Ethelbergers, fueled by a desperate pride and the life-giving water from the great cistern, made progress. They worked with a grim, focused energy, the sounds of their labor echoing through the valley, the clang of pry bars, the shouts of encouragement, the rhythmic chanting of work songs that were as old as the mountains themselves. Rorik, who had been a quiet but constant presence, sought Lyra out one evening as she rested, her muscles burning, her hands raw. "You're playing a dangerous game, girl," he said, his voice low. "Valerius is not a patient man. He sees this display of yours, this stubborn self-reliance, as a challenge." "And what would you have me do, Rorik?" Lyra asked, wariness etched into her voice. "Bow down? Let them erase us, name by name, tradition by tradition, until Athelberg is just another forgotten tributary to his great grey river?" Rorik looked at her for a long moment, his usual cynicism absent. "No," he said softly. "No, I wouldn't. But know this, he won't leave without what he came for. The water, yes, but more than that, your knowledge and your submission. He needs to make Athelberg an example, one way or another." He paused. He's offered me a permanent position, liaison to the newly integrated mountain territories. He gave a hollow laugh. A fancy title for a keeper of tame bears. Lyra felt a pang of something. Disappointment? Betrayal? Rorik had been an unexpected ally, a window to the outside world. And you will accept, he shrugged. A man must eat, and perhaps from the inside one can nudge the great beast a little, or at least warn the rabbits when it's about to stamp. He looked away, towards the distant campfires of the Volscians. They plan to announce the formal accord of Aethelberg's integration at the next full moon. There will be a feast, speeches. Valerius likes his conquests to look like celebrations. The full moon, less than a fortnight away. The water from the cistern flowed, but time was running out. Lyra had shown Aethelberg could rally, could achieve. But could they withstand the inexorable, patient, smiling pressure of a power like Valerius, a power that didn't just conquer, but absorbed, digested, and remade everything in its own image? The true test was not the broken channel, but the unbroken will of the unifier. The days leading up to the full moon were fraught with an almost unbearable tension. Valerius's pronouncements became more frequent, his gifts more pointedly generous, his soldiers' presence more visible. He spoke of Aethelberg as if its integration were already a settled fact, praising their wisdom in choosing to join his burgeoning confederation. The word choice felt like a mockery to Lyra. She focused her energy on two fronts. Firstly, the ongoing, meticulous work on the Northern Spur. Under her guidance and using a blend of traditional Aethelberg methods and cautiously adopted efficiencies, they were making remarkable progress. The sheer communal effort was a silent act of defiance, a demonstration of Aethelberg's enduring spirit. But it was also, Lyra knew, a race against a deadline they couldn't win in purely physical terms. Secondly, she spent her evenings in deep communion with her father's journals and the intricate mechanisms of the great cistern's release system, which she now visited daily under the watchful but distant eyes of Volscian observers. Drusus, frustrated by her reticence but fascinated by the ancient engineering, had grudgingly allowed her continued access, perhaps hoping to glean more through observation than direct questioning. Lyra understood the primary release, the flow regulator, the overflow failsafe. But there were other, more subtle markings on the levers, smaller pictograms she hadn't fully deciphered. They hinted at something more. Not just release, but perhaps redirection, the ability to channel water to even older, deeper, perhaps entirely forgotten subterranean aquifers, a way to seed the mountain's deep heart in times of surplus, a failsafe beyond the failsafe. It was a wild thought, unsupported by any clear text, only by the faintest etchings and her own intuitive feel for the system's deep logic. A way for the ancestors to ensure that even if all surface knowledge was lost, the mountain itself would remember, holding its lifeblood in trust. Cailan, meanwhile, had retreated into a brooding silence, observing Valerius's machinations with a helpless fury. The other elders were divided. Some, like Demetrius, were beginning to argue for pragmatic acceptance, hoping to salvage some small measure of autonomy by cooperating. Theron, increasingly enamoured by Volscian promises of a wider world, spent more time near their encampment, learning their drills, listening to their stories. Lyra saw him drifting away, a painful symbol of the divisions Valerius was so skillfully exploiting. One evening, as Lyra emerged from the now familiar passage to the great cistern's control chamber, Drusus was waiting for her, not with his usual engineers, but alone. His arrogance seemed diminished, replaced by a weary frustration. "This Valerius," Drusus said, his voice low, almost conspiratorial, "he sees your systems, your ancestral wisdom, as a tool. Nothing more. He will learn what he can, standardize it, and then your unique artistry will be discarded as inefficient." He looked at her directly. "I am an engineer, Lyra. I respect true mastery, even when it is unorthodox. What he plans here, it is not progress. It is consumption." Lyra was stunned by his candour. "Why are you telling me this, Drusus?" He shrugged, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Perhaps a scientist's distaste for the political corruption of pure knowledge, or a subordinate's resentment of an overbearing master. Perhaps I believe that some things are worth preserving in their original form, not merely as grist for an empire's mill. Or perhaps, a wry smile touched his lips, I simply dislike seeing a clever puzzle broken by a blunt instrument. He paused. Valerius intends the formal accord to include a demonstration. He wants you to operate the cistern's release, to show your people that their own waterkeeper accepts the new order. He will have his scribes record every step, every nuance, and then Ethelberg's greatest secret will belong to him. The blood drained from Lyra's face. To be forced to perform her sacred duty as a public spectacle, a symbol of her own people's subjugation, it was a cruelty Valerius would surely relish. "He leaves me no choice," Lyra whispered. "There is always a choice, as waterkeeper," Drusus said, his voice barely audible, though sometimes all choices lead to different kinds of sorrow. He turned and walked away, leaving Lyra standing alone, the weight of his words pressing down on her far more heavily than the mountain itself. The night before the full moon, Lyra made a pilgrimage, not to the great cistern, but to the small, humble shrine of the source spirit, where Calen still kept his lonely vigils. She found him there, gaunt and frail, but his eyes burned with an unquenched fire. "They will make a mockery of us, Lyra," he rasped, his voice filled with pain. "Our sacred waters, our ancient ways, paraded for their amusement, their records." "Calen," Lyra said, kneeling beside him. "The ancestors, they did not just build for their time, they built for all time. They understood cycles, endings, new beginnings." She took a deep breath. "There are other channels, deeper still, ways for the water to be held in trust, even if the surface is troubled." Calen looked at her, his eyes searching hers. He saw no deceit, only a profound, sorrowful certainty. "What will you do, child?" "What a waterkeeper must," Lyra said. "Preserve the essence, even if the vessel breaks." She didn't explain further. She wasn't entirely sure herself what she would do, only that Drusus's warning, combined with her faint understanding of the cistern's deepest secrets, had sparked a desperate, audacious idea. A choice that led to sorrow, yes, but perhaps also to a different kind of endurance. The day of the full moon dawned bright and clear. Ethelberg was unnaturally quiet. Valerius's soldiers were everywhere, their polished armor reflecting the innocent sunlight. A platform had been erected in the central clearing, tables laden with food and wine, Volscian provisions, a stark reminder of their new dependency, were set out. Valerius, magnificent in a deep crimson cloak, addressed the assembled Ethelbergers, his voice resonant with false bonhomie and steely resolve. He spoke of a shared future, of prosperity, of the strength of unity. He praised Ethelberg's wisdom. And then he summoned Lyra. "And now," Valerius proclaimed, his arm sweeping towards the path leading to the cistern, "as a symbol of this joyful union, Lyra of the Waterkeepers, who so brilliantly rediscovered her ancestors' gifts, will demonstrate the great heart of Ethelberg, the source of its life, for all to witness. Its power will now serve not just this valley, but the greater good of the Volscian people." Drusus stood near the cistern entrance, his face impassive. Scribes with their tablets and styluses were positioned to record every detail. Lyra walked towards the cistern, her heart a cold stone in her chest. She could feel the eyes of her people on her, some fearful, some hopeful, some accusatory. Theron watched her, his face troubled, his earlier enthusiasm for the Volscians now visibly shaken by the stark reality of their dominion. Calen stood alone, near the ancient meeting stones, a figure of tragic dignity. She entered the familiar control chamber. The great levers gleamed faintly in the torchlight. She knew what Valerius expected, a standard release, a demonstration of controllable power. Her hands moved towards the main lever, the flow regulator, and then they shifted. With a sudden, desperate surge of strength born of love for her valley and a defiant refusal to let its soul be stolen, she ignored the primary controls. Instead, she threw her entire weight against the other set of levers, the ones whose deeper purpose she had only just begun to divine, the ones connected to the faintest pictograms, the ones that hinted at the mountain's secret heart. The levers resisted, ancient, unused for millennia. But Lyra, fueled by a sorrowful resolve, strained against them. There was a terrible, grinding shriek of metal on stone, a sound that seemed to tear through the very fabric of the mountain. The ground beneath her feet bucked violently. Dust and small pebbles rained down from the cavern roof. Outside, a stunned silence fell over the clearing. Valerius's smile faltered. The joyous facade of the formal accord shattered. Even the stoic Volscian soldiers looked around in alarm as the mountain groaned, a deep, guttural sound of immense forces being disturbed. Drusus, his face pale, took an involuntary step towards the cistern entrance. "What is she doing?" he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Kalen watched, his eyes wide, a flicker of terrible understanding dawning. He remembered Lyra's cryptic words, deeper still, held in trust. Inside the chamber, Lyra clung to the levers as the world seemed to come apart around her. The roaring of water was different now, not the controlled release she had initiated before, but a sound of immense diversion, of water being pulled downwards into the unfathomable depths of the mountain. She felt a colossal shift, as if the very water table of Ethelberg was being reconfigured by an ancient, powerful design. The main release channel, the one that fed the valley, did not surge as Valerius had expected. Instead, after a brief initial gush, the flow from the great cistern towards the surface outlets began to diminish, then slow to a trickle, then stop. A gasp of horror went up from the Ethelbergers. Their miracle, their salvation, was vanishing before their eyes. Valerius's face was a mask of cold fury. "What treachery is this?" he roared, striding towards the cistern. "Drusus, seize her!" Drusus hesitated for a fatal second, torn between obedience and a sudden, chilling respect for the audacity of Lyra's act. It was Kalen who moved first. With a strength no one knew the frail elder still possessed, he threw himself in front of Valerius, blocking his path. "Ethelberg's heart is not for your taking, Unifier," Kalen cried, his voice ringing with a desperate final authority. "Its secrets belong to the mountain." Volscian soldiers surged forward, but in that moment of confusion, as the earth still trembled and the familiar sound of Ethelberg's lifeblood faded, a profound and terrifying change was occurring. The very springs that fed the valley, even those not directly linked to the great cistern, began to falter, their flow reducing as if the mountain itself were drawing its waters inward, into a vast hidden reserve. Lyra stumbled out of the control chamber, covered in dust, her face streaked with grime and tears. She met Valerius's murderous gaze with a look of profound, sorrowful defiance. "The water is safe," she choked out, "beyond your reach, beyond anyone's, until the mountain deems it time." Valerius understood. This wasn't just sabotage. This was a fundamental alteration, a deliberate sealing away of the valley's primary resource, triggered by ancient, forgotten mechanisms he could not comprehend, let alone control. Ethelberg, the prize he had come to claim, was, in an instant, becoming barren. Its greatest asset, the water, was now a memory, a legend. His ambition, his meticulous plans, his vision of Ethelberg as a productive jewel in his confederation, all turned to dust. The cost of subduing this valley, of trying to force its secrets from it now, would be immense. And for what? A dry husk. His handsome face contorted with rage. "You have destroyed your own people, girl," he spat. "For what? A stubborn, foolish pride." "No," Lyra said, her voice gaining strength, though tears streamed down her face. "I have preserved its essence, its memory, its soul. You can claim the stones, Valerius, you can claim the valley, but you will not have its heart." The Ethelbergers looked on, stunned, horrified, yet with a dawning, terrible understanding. Lyra had not saved their fields. She had perhaps damned them to a future of hardship, of dispersal. But she had denied their conqueror his ultimate prize. She had chosen memory over servitude, spirit over substance. Drusus, his face a mixture of professional dismay and unwilling admiration, finally gave the order. "Take her." But as the Volscian soldiers moved towards Lyra, a change came over the Ethelbergers. The initial shock was replaced by a slow-burning fury, a desperate, cornered courage. They had lost their water, their future in this valley looked bleak, but they would not stand by and see the one who had dared to defy their conqueror dragged away. Theron, his youthful face set in grim lines, stepped in front of Lyra, a simple woodsman's axe in his hand. Other young men and women moved with him. Valerius watched, his calculating mind weighing the costs. A bloody skirmish here now, for a valley that had just lost its primary value? His reputation as a bringer of order, of prosperity, would be tarnished. He had misjudged this place, misjudged this stubborn, resourceful waterkeeper. He raised a hand, halting his soldiers. His eyes, cold and hard, met Lyra's. "You will regret this day, Lyra of Ethelberg," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "You will wander in dry places, and your people will curse your name." He turned abruptly. "We leave. This valley is a tomb. Let them tend its dust." The Volscians, efficient even in retreat, began to withdraw, their dreams of a compliant, water-rich new territory shattered. They left behind a stunned, grieving community, a valley whose lifeblood had been drawn deep into the earth, and a young woman who had made an impossible choice. Rorik was among the last to leave with Valerius's contingent. He paused by Lyra, his face etched with a complex sorrow. "You chose the hardest path, girl," he said quietly. "The path of memory. It's a heavy burden to carry in a thirsty land." "It is all we have left, Rorik," Lyra replied, her voice hollow. "Perhaps not all," he said. He pressed something small and metallic into her hand, the Volscian shovel. "Efficiency has its uses, even when planting bitter seeds. Farewell, waterkeeper of a dry spring." He turned and followed his new master out of the silent, stricken valley of Ethelberg. The silence that descended upon Ethelberg after the Volscians departed was heavier than any drought. The channels were dry. The great cisterns, which had been the valley's pride, were merely carved stone, echoing emptiness. The rich earth of the terraces, deprived of its lifeblood, began to crack under the relentless sun. Despair was a tangible thing, a suffocating blanket. Many looked at Lyra with accusation in their eyes. Demetrius openly called her the Valley Ruiner. Calen, though he understood the terrible necessity of her choice more than most, was broken by the visible death of the land he loved. He withered, and within a month he was gone, buried near the silent, moss-covered shrine of the Source Spirit. Lyra bore the weight of their grief, their anger, her own sorrow a constant ache. She had saved Ethelberg's soul, perhaps, but at the cost of its life in this place. The unifier had been denied, but the victory felt like ashes in her mouth. Yet, even in the depths of their despair, the spirit of Ethelberg, the stubborn resilience honed by generations of living in the harsh beauty of the Apennines, began to stir. Theron, his youthful idealism tempered by the harsh reality, became Lyra's unwavering support. He organized the young people not for defiance, but for survival. "The water is gone from here," Lyra told the assembled, grieving remnants of her community, her voice raw but firm. "But the knowledge of how to find it, how to understand it, how to live with it, that knowledge is not gone. Valerius did not take that. It is within us." She held up the Volscian shovel Rorik had given her. "The ancestors adapted, we must adapt too. This valley, this was one vessel. The water, the life, must find new vessels." Slowly, painstakingly, they began to prepare for an exodus. It was a heart-wrenching process. Leaving the homes their families had known for centuries, the terraces they had tilled, the sacred groves, the silent channels that were like veins in their collective memory. They packed what little they could carry, seeds from the hardiest plants, tools, the few precious scrolls of ancestral lore that had survived. Lyra, now unequivocally their leader, not by acclaim, but by the grim necessity of her actions, carried her father's journals, their weight both a burden and a comfort. She knew Valerius's curse. You will wander in dry places, perhaps. But they would wander with knowledge. They would search for new springs, new valleys, new ways to make life flourish, carrying the essence of Ethelberg within them. Their journey out of Ethelberg was an elegy written in dust and sorrow. Each familiar landmark now receding behind them was a fresh pang of loss. The high peaks that had once cradled them in protective isolation now seemed to watch their departure with a stony indifference. The wind whispered through the dry channels, a mournful sigh for a life that was no more. Lyra led them, not with grand pronouncements, but with a quiet, focused determination. She used her knowledge of the land, gleaned from her father's teachings and her own explorations, to find hidden seeps, small, unremembered springs in forgotten clefts of the mountains, enough to sustain their small, dwindling band. The Volscian shovel proved its worth, its efficient design helping them to dig, to uncover, to make the most of what little the dry land offered. It was a bitter irony, using a tool of the conqueror to survive his curse, but Lyra had learned that survival often meant embracing such contradictions. They encountered other small, scattered communities in the rugged Apennine wilderness, some welcoming, some suspicious. To those who offered succor, Lyra shared what knowledge she could, of finding water, of terracing difficult slopes, of reading the subtle signs of the land. She asked for nothing in return but safe passage, or perhaps a handful of seed from a plant unfamiliar to her. The essence of Ethelberg, the spirit of the waterkeepers, began to disperse, to mingle with other traditions, other streams of knowledge. Years passed. Lyra aged, the lines of hardship etching themselves onto her face, but her eyes retained their keen, observant light. The scar above her eyebrow was a silver crescent now, a constant reminder of past loss and hard-won resilience. Theron remained by her side, no longer a youth but a capable man, his early infatuation with Volscian grandeur replaced by a deep, quiet loyalty to Lyra and the memory of Ethelberg. They never found another valley as perfectly suited to their ancestral skills as Ethelberg had been. But they adapted. They learned to cultivate hardier crops in drier soils. They became skilled at finding water where others saw only barrenness. They taught their children the stories of Ethelberg, not as a lost paradise, but as a place of profound learning, a testament to ingenuity and the courage to make impossible choices. The legend of the great cistern, of the water drawn deep into the mountain's heart, became a sacred myth, a symbol of ultimate preservation, of a life force held in trust for a future time. One day, decades after their exodus, Lyra, now an old woman, her hair as white as the winter's snows on the Apennine peaks, sat with her granddaughter Elara by a small, carefully tended spring in a modest hidden oasis they had helped cultivate. Elara, her eyes bright with the same curiosity that had once burned in Lyra, was tracing patterns in the damp earth. "Grandmother," Elara asked, "will the great water of Ethelberg ever return to the surface?" Lyra looked at the distant, hazy outline of the mountains that had once been her home. A faint smile touched her lips. "Perhaps, child, the mountain remembers. And water. Water always finds its way, sooner or later. Sometimes in great rivers, sometimes in hidden streams, sometimes in the wisdom passed from one hand to another." She took Elara's small hand, its skin still soft, and guided it to feel the pulse of the tiny spring. The true heart of Ethelberg was never just the water in the channels, Elara. It was the understanding in the hands that guided it, the spirit in the hearts that respected it. "And that," Lyra said, her gaze meeting her granddaughter's, clear and steady, "that can never be truly lost, as long as we remember to listen, to learn, and to share." News, carried by wandering traders like Rorik had once been, sometimes reached them. Valerius's Volscian confederation had indeed grown vast, a powerful entity in the plains and lesser hills. Its roads were straight, its laws uniform, its legions formidable, but there were also whispers of strain, of overreach. Of lands exhausted by intensive, standardized agriculture, of water systems, vast and impressive, that sometimes failed catastrophically because they lacked the nuanced, localized understanding that had been Ethelberg's strength. The cycle, Lyra knew, continued, indifferent to the ambitions of men. Valerius had built an empire, but he had not conquered the fundamental truths of the land, truths that Ethelberg, in its own small, tragic way, had honored. Lyra closed her eyes. The murmur of the small spring, a soothing balm. The awe she had once felt for the grand mechanisms of Ethelberg was still there, but it was tempered now by a deeper, quieter understanding. The legacy of her people was not in stone and channels alone, but in the resilience of the human spirit, in the adaptability of knowledge, in the enduring connection between people and the living earth. It was a legacy whispered on the wind, carried in the taste of fresh water, nurtured in the hands of a new generation. Ethelberg was gone, and yet Ethelberg lived. The sun dipped lower, painting the rugged peaks in hues of orange and purple. Elara leaned against Lyra, tracing the lines on her grandmother's weathered hand. "Tell me again about the shadow lock, grandmother, and the levers deep in the mountain." Lyra smiled, a genuine, unfettered smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. The pain of Ethelberg's loss had never truly faded, but it had been overlaid with the quiet satisfaction of survival, of continuity. The stories were important. They were the seeds. "The old man's finger," Lyra began, her voice taking on the familiar cadence of a storyteller. "It stands guard over the sky wall, even now, and on certain days when the sun is just so." As she spoke, she saw not just the past, but the faint, shimmering possibilities of the future. Perhaps, generations hence, someone descended from their scattered people, carrying the ember of this knowledge, would return to those high valleys. Perhaps they would find the world changed again, Valerius's empire a faded memory, its straight roads cracked and overgrown, its great aqueducts dry. Perhaps then someone with Lyra's spirit, with her understanding, would know how to listen for the mountain's breath, to seek the signs, to once again awaken the waters held in trust. The legacy was not a monument, fixed and unchanging. It was a current flowing underground, waiting for the right moment, the right hands, to bring it to the surface once more. The cycle of rise and fall, of flourishing and decline, was not just an epic of great empires. It was a quiet truth lived out in countless hidden valleys, in the resilience of ordinary people, in the enduring wisdom of the earth itself. Lyra looked at Alara, whose dark, observant eyes mirrored her own youthful intensity. The scar above Lyra's eyebrow, a memento of a flood that had shaped her destiny, no longer ached with the same sharpness. It was a part of her, a part of the story. And the deepest secret, Alara, Lyra whispered, drawing the child closer, was not the mechanism itself, but the courage to use it, even when all other hope seemed lost. The courage to choose what truly matters, even at great cost. The stars began to prick the darkening sky, the same stars that had shone over Romulus as he first marked Rome's boundaries, over Augustus as he transformed a city of brick to marble, over Constantine the Lust as he made his last stand. They shone now over a small, hidden oasis in the Apennines, where an old woman passed on the essence of a lost valley to a young girl. The stream by their side murmured its timeless song, a song of stone and memory, of endings and new beginnings. The water, Lyra knew, would always find its way, and so too would the human spirit. The fire in their small hearth crackled, casting dancing shadows on the rock walls of their shelter. Alara, lulled by the story and the warmth, was drifting to sleep, her head resting on Lyra's lap. Lyra gently stroked her hair, her gaze distant, reflective. She thought of Rorik, the pragmatic trader, and wondered where his roads had led him. Had he found a measure of peace within Valerius's structured world, or did he still yearn for the unpredictable authenticity of places like Ethelberg? Had he ever spoken of them, of the water-keeper who had made the mountain drink its own rivers? Perhaps. Stories, like seeds, could travel on unexpected winds. She thought of Drusus, the Volscian engineer, a man of intellect, caught between his respect for true mastery and his loyalty to a system that valued control above all. Had he ever tried to replicate Ethelberg's subtle engineering, or had he dismissed it as an anomaly, a footnote in the grand march of Valerius's progress? Lyra suspected the latter. True understanding, the kind that had guided her ancestors, couldn't be merely copied. It had to be lived, breathed, earned through generations of communion with a specific place. And Valerius. His ambition had been a force of nature in itself. Lyra had seen him as a conqueror, a destroyer. But now, with the long perspective of years, she saw him also as an instrument of change, a catalyst. His pressure had forced Ethelberg to confront its own stagnation, had pushed Lyra herself to unlock her people's deepest, most desperate secrets. Without Valerius, the great cistern might have remained a forgotten legend, its waters dormant forever. His desire to consume had, paradoxically, led to an act of ultimate preservation. The unifier had, in his own way, ensured that Ethelberg's essence, if not its physical form, would endure in a way he could never have intended. The cyclical narrative, she mused. Valerius's empire, for all its current strength, would one day face its own crises, its own environmental challenges, its own internal fractures. Perhaps then, the fragmented knowledge of Ethelberg, dispersed and adapted by Lyra's descendants and others they had touched, would offer small, vital solutions. Perhaps the great centralized systems would fail, and the resilient, localized wisdom, the ability to listen to the land, to work with its subtle energies rather than against them, would prove its enduring worth. The story of Ethelberg was not just one of loss. It was a story of transformation. The physical community was gone, scattered. The grand water systems were dry. But the idea of Ethelberg, its spirit of ingenuity, its deep connection to the natural world, its courage in the face of impossible odds, that lived on. It lived in Lyra, in Theron, in Alara, and in all those who would carry their stories and their adapted knowledge into the future. The ashes of their campfire glowed softly. Outside, the vast silence of the Apennines was broken only by the whisper of the night wind and the faint, eternal murmur of hidden waters moving deep within the earth. Lyra felt a sense of peace, a quiet acceptance. The dominant emotion was no longer the sharp grief of loss, but a profound reflective awe at the tenacity of life, the resilience of spirit, the enduring echoes of a civilization, however small, however seemingly defeated, that had dared to choose its own form of immortality. Her hand rested on Ilara's sleeping head. The child was the future, the new vessel. The stream of knowledge would flow through her into new times, new challenges. And that, Lyra knew, was a legacy more powerful than any empire carved in stone. It was a legacy written in water, in memory, and in the unyielding hope of the human heart. The cycle would continue. Aethelberg in its essence would endure. Decades later, Lyra was gone, her stories woven into the fabric of her descendants' lives. Ilara, now a woman grown, a leader in her own right, often found herself gazing at the distant, formidable silhouette of the Aethelberg Mountains. Her community, a fusion of Aethelberg refugees and other mountain folk they had encountered and allied with, had found a precarious but sustainable existence in a series of smaller interlinked valleys, far from the reach of what had once been Valerius's burgeoning Volscian state. News of that state still filtered through, though less frequently now. The great Volscian Confederation, as it had been grandly named, had indeed reached its zenith. Its legions had marched far. Its standardized laws had been imposed over vast territories, and its engineered water systems, including some based on crude interpretations of Aethelberg's principles, gleaned from Drusus's early frustrated reports, had initially brought great agricultural yields to the plains. But the whispers Ilara heard now were different. They spoke of salinated fields in the lowlands, where the massive centrally controlled irrigation schemes had, over generations, poisoned the earth. They spoke of once mighty rivers, diverted too aggressively, now dwindling to trickles, their deltas dying. They spoke of internal strife within the Volscian territories, of regional governors becoming overly powerful, of resentment simmering among assimilated peoples whose local customs had been suppressed but never extinguished. The very efficiency and standardization that had been Valerius's strength had become a brittleness, an inability to adapt to localized environmental feedback or diverse cultural needs. The unifier's dream was fraying at the edges. One day, a traveller arrived in Ilara's valley. He was old, his clothes worn, his accent bearing traces of the Volscian plains, but overlaid with the dialects of many wandered lands. He introduced himself as Marcus, a former minor scribe in the service of a provincial Volscian governor, now seeking only a quiet place to live out his days. He carried with him a few tattered scrolls. Ilara, cautious but hospitable, offered him shelter. As they spoke, Marcus learned of their Aethelberg heritage, of the legendary waterkeeper Lyra and the mountain that drank its own rivers. His eyes, weary but intelligent, lit with a strange recognition. "Aethelberg," he murmured. There was a curious report, very old, in the provincial archives, dismissed as folklore by most. It spoke of a valley whose water source vanished due to an act of profound, almost mythical engineering by a woman named Lyra. He looked at Ilara. It was attributed to local superstition, a way to explain a natural disaster. But your story, it breathes life into the old ink. He then unrolled one of his own scrolls. It was a copy, he explained, of a fragment from the personal journals of a highly respected but somewhat disgraced imperial engineer from Valerius's early reign, a man named Drusus. Drusus, Marcus explained, after his service under Valerius, fell out of favour. He argued for more adaptable water systems, for studying local topographies and ancient existing watercourses rather than imposing monolithic designs everywhere. He was accused of inefficiency, of romanticizing primitive methods. He spent his later years in obscurity, writing treatises that few read. The fragment Marcus showed Ilara was astounding. It was Drusus's detailed, awestruck and deeply frustrated account of the Aethelberg cistern, the shadow lock, and Lyra's final desperate act. He hadn't understood the why of it then, attributing it to defiant rage or local religious fanaticism. But he had meticulously recorded the what, the sequence of levers Lyra had used, the pictograms she had seemingly deciphered, the mountain's terrifying response. He wrote, Marcus read, his voice hushed. She did not merely destroy, she redirected. She spoke to the mountain in a language I am only beginning to suspect exists. The fools called it ruin. I call it a conversation beyond my comprehension at the time. She was not a primitive, she was a custodian of a different order of knowledge. Alara felt a shiver run down her spine. Drusus, the arrogant Volscian, had in the end glimpsed the truth, and through this old scribe his words had found their way back to Lyra's descendants. This knowledge, Alara said, her voice thick with emotion, pointing to Drusus's diagrams of the levers, much of it was lost with the elders who died in the Exodus. My grandmother, Lyra, she carried the spirit, the principles. But the exact sequences for the deepest redirections, she feared using them again without absolute certainty. Marcus looked at her. The Volscian plains are dying of thirst, Alara. Their grand systems are failing. They built too big, too fast, without listening. Perhaps the time for the mountain to speak again is drawing near. Perhaps this knowledge was not meant to be lost, but merely held in trust. The idea was staggering. Could it be that Lyra's desperate act, meant to deny a conqueror, had also preserved a secret that could, generations later, offer a sliver of hope to the descendants of that same conqueror's ailing civilization? The cycle, Alara thought, was more intricate, more ironic than anyone could imagine. The decision was not hers alone. She brought Marcus and Drusus's scroll before her own community's council. The debate was long and arduous. To return to Aethelberg, to attempt to awaken waters that had slept for nearly a century, based on an enemy engineer's notes and an old man's faith, it was a monumental risk. The valley might be truly dead. The mechanisms might be irreparably damaged. And Valerius's successors, if any semblance of Volscian power remained in that region, might see it as a threat. But the alternative was to watch the slow degradation of the wider world, a world their children would inherit. Lyra had taught them about adaptation, about responsibility that extended beyond their own small circle. In the end, a small expedition was assembled, led by Alara. Marcus, despite his age, insisted on accompanying them, Drusus's scroll clutched in his frail hands. Theron's son, a young man named Caius, who possessed Lyra's observant eyes and Theron's quiet strength, was chosen as their chief engineer. Their journey back to the Ethelberg Valley was a pilgrimage into a land of ghosts. The lower plains they crossed were indeed showing signs of ecological stress, the once mighty Volscian infrastructure often in disrepair. When they finally reached the high pass and looked down into their ancestral home, it was a scene of profound desolation. The terraces were eroded, the once green slopes covered in scrub. The central clearing was overgrown, the ancient meeting stones toppled. Aethelberg looked like a tomb, just as Valerius had cursed. But as they drew closer, Caius, scouting ahead, let out a cry. At the base of the sky wall, near where the shadow of the old man's finger would fall, a tiny patch of impossible green clung to the barren rock. A seep, a mere trickle, but it was fresh water. The mountain, it seemed, had not entirely forgotten how to weep. With a mixture of trepidation and fierce hope, they made the arduous climb to the hidden entrance of the great cistern. The shadow lock, remarkably, still functioned, the massive stone door groaning open as the sun's alignment perfected itself. Inside, the control chamber was thick with dust, cobwebs hanging like ancient shrouds. But the great bronze levers were still there. Using Drusus's meticulous notes as a guide, cross-referencing them with the fragmented Aethelberg lore Alara had inherited from Lyra, Caius began the painstaking process of understanding not the catastrophic diversion Lyra had been forced to make, but the more subtle, restorative sequences. It took days. There were moments of despair, of near failure. But finally, with a groan of ancient mechanisms responding to a touch they had not felt for generations, a different sound began to emanate from the mountain's depths. Not the roar of full release, nor the terrible sucking sound of deep diversion, but a gentle, steady welling. Slowly, hesitantly, water began to flow again from the primary outlets of the great cistern. Not a torrent, but a measured, sustainable stream, enough to begin the slow, arduous process of healing the valley, enough to offer a future. Alara stood where her grandmother had once stood, watching the water return. It was not a triumphant restoration of the past. Aethelberg, as it had been, was gone forever. This would be something new, built on the foundations of memory, tempered by hardship, guided by a wisdom that had been forced to travel through shadow and silence to re-emerge. Marcus watched, tears streaming down his ancient face. She knew, he whispered. Lyra, she knew the water would remember. The legacy of Ethelberg, Elara realized, was not just in the preservation of knowledge, but in the courage to believe in renewal, even after devastation. It was in understanding that decline is not always an end, but can be a fallow period before a new, perhaps humbler, but more resilient, growth. The stream was flowing again, a testament to an old waterkeeper's impossible choice and a new generation's willingness to listen to the whispers of the enduring earth. The cycle continued, not in grand empires, but in the quiet, persistent pulse of life, guided by wisdom held in trust. The reawakening of Ethelberg's waters was not a swift miracle, but the beginning of a long, arduous labour. The valley, scarred by nearly a century of neglect, did not bloom overnight. The first waters brought forth a flush of opportunistic weeds, alongside the tentative green shoots of ancient seeds they had carefully sown. The eroded terraces needed rebuilding, the choked secondary channels painstaking clearance. Elara and her small band, joined by a trickle of others, descendants of the Ethelberg diaspora drawn by improbable rumour, and even a few desperate families from the blighted Volscian plains seeking refuge in a new way, worked with a quiet, almost sacred intensity. Caius, guided by Drusus's scrolls and Lyra's remembered principles, became a true waterkeeper, learning to balance the cistern's output with the valley's capacity for healing, understanding that true sustainability was a dance, not a command. Marcus, the old scribe, did not live to see the valley fully restored, but he spent his last months meticulously documenting their progress, adding his own observations to Drusus's work, creating a new testament to Ethelberg's enduring knowledge. He taught the younger generation the basics of lettering and record-keeping, ensuring that their rediscovery would not itself be lost to fading memory. His final request was to be buried near the tiny, persistent seep at the foot of the skywall, the first promise of the water's return. The new Ethelberg that slowly emerged was different from the old. It was humbler, more cautious. The population was smaller, their ambitions less about mastery and more about coexistence. They did not seek to recreate the past wholesale, but to weave its best threads into a new pattern. They diversified their crops, planting hardier, drought-resistant species alongside their ancestral grains. They learned to read the land with an even deeper attention, understanding that the grand systems of the cistern were a gift to be used wisely, supplemented by the careful husbanding of every spring, every seep, every drop of dew. The legend of Lyra grew with each passing season. She became more than an ancestor. She was a foundational myth, the waterkeeper who chose memory, the one who had understood the mountain's deepest secrets and had possessed the courage to act for a future she would not see. Her scar, remembered through Elara's stories, became a symbol not of loss, but of profound, sacrificial wisdom. Occasionally, travellers from the decaying Volscian territories would find their way to the remote valley, drawn by whispers of a place where water still flowed clean and the land was slowly healing. Some came seeking to learn, others merely to survive. Elara and her council, remembering Lyra's principle of sharing knowledge, offered what aid they could, but they were wary. They would not allow their fragile renaissance to be overwhelmed or co-opted. Ethelberg's wisdom was now a precious, guarded flame. They learned that the Volscian Confederation had not collapsed entirely, but had fragmented into smaller warring fiefdoms, their grand infrastructure projects often the first casualties of neglect and conflict. The straight roads were broken, the aqueducts crumbling. Valerius's dream of a unified, efficient empire had dissolved into a patchwork of struggling territories, a stark testament to the unsustainability of growth without deep understanding, of power without wisdom. The cycle had indeed turned. Elara, standing by the gently flowing northern spur, now a modest but reliable stream, often thought of her grandmother. Lyra had faced the zenith of an external power and the agonizing decline of her own world. She had made a choice that seemed like destruction, but had been an act of profound faith in the enduring nature of life and knowledge. The new Ethelberg was not a resurrection of the old glory, but something more resilient, more attuned. It was a testament to the idea that true civilization lies not in monumental edifices or vast dominion, but in the delicate balance between human ingenuity and the rhythms of the natural world, in the continuity of wisdom passed through generations, in the courage to adapt, to let go, and to begin anew. The awe was still there, the contemplation, the sense of connection to a deep and storied past. But the melancholy that had tinged Lyra's later years was, in Alara's time, transmuted into a quiet, determined hope. The waters of Ethelberg flowed, a gentle murmur in the heart of the Apennines, a symbol of enduring legacy, a promise that even from the deepest sorrow, life, guided by wisdom and courage, could always find a way to return, to flourish, to continue its timeless, cyclical dance. The stream, lifeblood of Ethelberg, tasted once more of stone and memory and the quiet, unyielding promise of renewal. As seasons turned into years and Alara herself grew older, the new Ethelberg found its equilibrium. It never regained the population or the sheer engineered grandeur of its predecessor, nor did it seek to. Its strength lay in its resilience, its diversity, and its profound understanding of the delicate web of life within its valley. The great cistern was used sparingly, a strategic reserve for the driest times, its primary function now almost symbolic, a reminder of the ancestors' foresight and Lyra's courageous sacrifice. Most of their water came from the careful cultivation of numerous smaller springs and catchments, a decentralized system that was less vulnerable to catastrophic failure. Caius, Alara's kinsman, became the keeper of Drusus's and Marcus's combined scrolls, adding his own observations and innovations. The Ethelberg system, as it came to be known by the few outsiders who learned of it, was not a rigid set of rules, but a living philosophy of water management, emphasizing observation, adaptation, and respect for the local environment. It was a stark contrast to the decaying remnants of the Volscian megaprojects in the plains below. One year, a delegation arrived. They were not warriors, nor traders in the usual sense. They were a group of elders and engineers from several struggling lowland communities, remnants of the fractured Volscian state. Their lands were parched, their ancient rivers mismanaged to the point of near death. They had heard the almost mythical tales of Ethelberg's renewal, of water flowing where all had been dust. They came not to conquer or to demand, but to humbly ask for guidance. Alara received them in the shade of a newly planted grove near the now gently flowing northern spur. She listened to their stories of hardship, of engineered solutions that had created more problems than they solved, of a people adrift without the foundational wisdom of how to live with their land. She saw in their faces not the arrogance of Valerius's time, but a desperate, weary hope. She remembered Lyra's ethos: share the knowledge. But she also remembered the need for caution. Ethelberg's ways cannot simply be copied and pasted onto your lands, Alara told them, her voice gentle but firm. Our solutions grew from this specific soil, this particular mountain. What we can offer is not a set of plans, but a way of seeing, a way of listening to what your own land, your own waters, are trying to tell you. She agreed to send Caius and a small team, not as overseers, but as advisors, to live among them for a time, to help them begin the slow process of observation and healing. It was a risk. But Alara knew that true legacy was not hoarded, but shared, allowing it to adapt and take new forms in new places. The seeds of Ethelberg, carried by Lyra into the wilderness, were now, through her descendants, finding fertile ground even in the heart of the former unifier's domain. Caius returned months later, his face etched with the complexities of his mission. Their land is deeply wounded, Alara, he reported. It will take generations. Some are too impatient, still seeking the grand, swift solution. But others are beginning to listen. They are rediscovering their own forgotten springs, their own local wisdom that was paved over by Valerius's roads and canals. It was not a triumph, but a quiet, incremental beginning. Ethelberg's influence would not be an empire of territory, but a slowly spreading philosophy of care and attunement. Alara, in her final years, often walked the paths her grandmother had walked, her hand trailing along the cool stones of the water channels. She would sit by the entrance to the great cistern, feeling the faint, ancient pulse of the waters held deep within, a silent testament to a cycle of loss and renewal that transcended human lifespans. She had fulfilled Lyra's hope, nurturing the essence of Ethelberg and allowing it to flow outwards, transformed but vital. The niche theme, the cyclical narrative of civilization, its rise, zenith, decline, fall, and enduring legacy, had played out not on the grand stage of Rome, but in this hidden valley in the life of one woman and her descendants. The niche theme, The cyclical narrative of civilization, its rise, zenith, decline, fall, and enduring legacy, had played out not on the grand stage of Rome, but in this hidden valley. In the life of one woman, and her Ethelberg had risen with its ancestors' ingenuity, reached a local zenith, faced decline through environmental pressure and its own rigidity, fallen under the threat of Valerius and Lyra's desperate choice, yet its legacy endured, transformed, to offer a seed of hope to the very civilization that had overshadowed it. The dominant emotions Lyra had embodied, awe, reflection, contemplation, a sense of continuity tinged with melancholy, were now woven into the cultural fabric of the new Ethelberg, a community that understood the impermanence of structures but the persistence of essential wisdom. They knew that even the greatest fall could be a prelude to a different kind of rising. As Elara looked out over the slowly greening valley, she knew their story was but one small eddy in the vast river of time. But it was their story, and it was enough. The water murmured its secrets, the mountain stood as silent witness, and the legacy of the waterkeepers flowed on, a quiet but unquenchable current in the heart of the ancient Apennines. The story, like the water, would always find its way. The final chapters of Elara's life were ones of quiet stewardship. The new Ethelberg, while never aspiring to the concentrated population of its ancestor, became a beacon of sustainable living in a world increasingly grappling with the consequences of past overreach. Caius, and then his children, continued the tradition of waterkeepers, their role now encompassing not just engineering, but also a profound ecological and historical understanding. Drusus's and Marcus's scrolls, carefully preserved and annotated, became foundational texts, studied alongside the fragmented oral traditions passed down from Lyra. The relationship with the lowland communities remained complex. Some saw Ethelberg as an anachronistic curiosity, a small pocket of archaic ways. Others, facing desertification and dwindling resources due to the failures of the old Volscian megasystems, increasingly looked to Ethelberg's model with a mixture of desperation and respect. Small groups would make the arduous journey, seeking not to join Ethelberg, but to learn its principles, how to read the land, how to implement small-scale adaptive water harvesting, how to foster a community ethic of resource conservation. Ethelberg did not send out conquerors or missionaries. It sent out listeners and sharers, individuals who would spend time in these other communities, helping them rediscover their own local environmental wisdom, often buried under layers of imposed, standardized Volscian practices. The legacy was spreading, not as a doctrine, but as an adaptable methodology, a way of thinking that empowered communities to find their own solutions, rooted in their specific place and time. One of Elara's last significant acts was to establish the Archive of Echoes. It was not a grand library, but a carefully protected repository within the mountain, near the Great Cistern's entrance. Here, stories were collected, not just Ethelberg's own, but the stories of other small communities, their successes, their failures, their unique ways of living with the land. It was founded on Lyra's belief that all such experiences held wisdom, that the resilience of life lay in its diversity. Travelers were encouraged to contribute their knowledge, a piece of a seed, a fragment of a song, a design for a tool. The archive was a testament to the idea that a civilization's true wealth was not in its material possessions or its territorial reach, but in its accumulated wisdom and its capacity for compassionate learning. It was a quiet counterpoint to the crumbling monuments of Valerius's once great confederation. When Elara finally passed, as old and revered as Lyra had been, the entire valley mourned, but not with the despair that had followed Lyra's forced exodus. They mourned a beloved leader, a wise elder, but they knew her work was secure. The principles she had championed were now deeply embedded in their way of life, and were taking root, however fragilely, in distant soils. The story of Rome, the original inspiration for this tale's deep structure, had spanned millennia, a vast epic of rise, conquest, glory, internal decay, division, and an eventual transformative fall, whose legacy still shaped the world. Ethelberg's story was a miniature, a single intense iteration of that grand cycle, played out in a hidden Italian valley. It showed that the same powerful themes, the struggle for identity, the tension between tradition and innovation, the impact of charismatic leaders and external pressures, The devastating consequences of unsustainable practices and the enduring power of an idea could resonate with equal profundity on a smaller, more intimate scale. The niche theme of a cyclical narrative of civilization was embodied in Ethelberg's own rise through ancestral ingenuity, its local zenith, its near-fatal decline under both environmental and external human pressure, its fall through Lyra's sacrifice and its subsequent transformed rebirth, and the quiet, enduring legacy it offered to a wider, struggling world. The niche theme of a cyclical narrative of civilization was embodied in Ethelberg's own rise through ancestral ingenuity, its local zenith, its near-fatal decline under both environmental and external human pressure, its fall through Lyra's sacrifice, and its subsequent transformed rebirth and birth. The message that even the greatest fall can be a crucible for a new kind of strength, and that true legacy often lies in intangible wisdom rather than tangible power, was lived out by its people. The dominant emotions of awe at resilience, contemplation of historical cycles, and a connection to enduring human values were Ethelberg's quiet song. Generations after Alara, the Ethelberg Valley remained a place of modest prosperity and profound ecological wisdom. It was not a hidden paradise, for the challenges of living in the high Apennines were ever present. But it was a community that knew itself, understood its limits, and cherished its legacy. A legacy not of conquest, but of listening, not of dominion, but of harmony. The waters, carefully managed, continued to flow, a constant reminder of the water-keepers who had come before, and of the enduring cyclical promise of life itself. The echo of Rome, in its grand arc, found a softer, more intimate resonance in the heart of this small, resilient valley.